Tyranids are terrifying because they represent an unstoppable, all-consuming force with no morality, individuality, or purpose beyond devouring everything in their path. There is no reasoning with them, no diplomacy, and no mercy, only total annihilation. In this video, we'll explore techniques to enhance your Grimdark painting and truly capture their nightmarish essence. I'm Nate the Feral Painter, and welcome to the Grimdark Compendium. So the techniques covered in this video aren't just limited to the Tyranids. They can be applied to any of your painting projects, and whether you're going to use these techniques individually on their own, or you can combine them to offer different ways to create a truly horrifying miniature. So what makes the Tyranids unique? Tyranid biology embodies a grotesque biohorror, nightmarish evolution, and the utter alien nature of their race. Their exoskeletons resemble fused remains of devoured organisms, creating a blend of hardened armor and organic horror, both insectile and disturbingly flesh-like. So there are a few things that we can do to our miniature before we even start to paint it and even prime it. And to do this, we can enhance the texture on the bone and the armor sections, and this will just heighten their grimdark and organic look. For this, I'm going to use some Tamiya mottling putty, and I'm going to thin this with some extra thin cement. And then what I do is just get an old brush and start to stipple this across the carapace to create a rough, uneven texture that'll mimic the hardened fused biomatter. Vallejo putty or liquid green stuff also works similarly when applied in layers, and you can build upon these layers as well to add as much depth as you desire. And once that is dry, I'm going to grab some sandpaper, and I have found that 2000 to 3000 grit sandpaper does work really well for this situation. Now, we're not going to apply a lot of pressure on this. We're literally just going to sand over without applying too much pressure, and what this will do is just add some subtle surface variation, and it's going to knock back some of those bumps and overall give it a more organic look. After that, I'm going to grab something like a small needle or a sculpting tool, and I'm going to add some fine indentations, and this will just further and enhance those organic details. At the end of it, this will just result in a rugged alien carapace that perfectly captures the Tyranid aesthetic. So Tyranid skin does come in lots of different forms, and there are a lot of different ways that we can actually paint the flesh on the Tyranids themselves. But looking around it, it tends to be a sickly stretched membrane over some pulsating, shifting muscles, and some of these Tyranids do have exposed vents that ripple, while others can secrete mucus and some digestive fluids. Their unsettled appearance evokes deep-sea horrors and venomous creatures. While the colour schemes vary, natural hues tend towards disturbing purples, bruised blues, blood-tingling reds, and sickly yellows, making them look diseased or toxic. The contrast between the pale, fleshly underbellies and the dark, spiny carapaces just reinforces their predatory nature. So when it comes to actually priming up the miniature, I'm going to choose a primer that is going to closely resemble the actual intended skin colour. So for this, I added a darker beige brown or a tan base, and then I followed this up by a light ivory primer, and I applied this zenithally. This will just help me establish some natural highlights and shadows while speeding up the painting process as well. So the first technique that I'm going to go over in this video, and it's one that is going to be popping up now and again because there's a lot of different ways that we can achieve this effect, and that of course is some mottling. Now mottling doesn't just have to be like adding speckles and freckles in and around your skin. This can also just be subtle variations in the skin tone, which will also add to that mottled effect. But for this, I'm just going to speckle some tiny dots of paint across the skin, and I do this by flicking it with a moistened brush and a sharp tool or paperclip. And you can use anything for this, such as contrast paints, but I tend to lean more towards inks and washes, as these have a translucent nature, which will come into play a little bit later on. And overall, these eventually, when we get towards the end, will appear sat underneath the skin. Feel free at this stage as well to experiment with different colours like purples or blues or even greens if you want to get some completely different variation on there. But also if you're just wanting some more subtle variation, for this you might choose some like browns or some more tan colours, or even colours that are just a little bit lighter or even darker than the actual skin tone that you've chosen, and these will just appear very subtly in and around the skin. Next, I'm going to hand paint in some veins around the skin. Now I know for some people this might be quite daunting, trying to get some really thin lines. However, I have found using these ultra thin liner brushes that are regularly available on places like Amazon or like your local hobby store. But these brushes are it just helps you get that a little bit more control. And again, when we're painting veins, they don't have to be perfectly straight lines. The goal here is to be irregular and uneven. So it's a great way to practice some brush control as well. As I repeated earlier, you can feel free to use different tones and colours depending on the type of veins that you want. Next up, I'm going to add some filters to the skin, and to do this I'm going to use an airbrush, and I'm just going to tint specific areas and specifically focusing on the joints and the mouth and the vent-like structures of the Tyranid. It's a good idea not to go overboard with this because you don't really want to fully shift the skin tone onto this. We're just going to add some small filters and build them up in thin layers to maintain a natural, airy look without overpowering the model. Now once that skin section is complete, it's a good idea at this stage to start to block out any of the other details on your miniature, such as the carapace, the teeth, and any other additional details that you might have around your creature. I do find, because we've got that lighter skin tone on, first of all, that just to block out some of these, I tend to use contrast paints quite a lot, because this is just a really fast and easy way to block out some of those details and also retain some of those shadows and highlights without adding additional colours and spending extra time on your miniature. Due to the size of this miniature, the carapace was gone over with an airbrush first, and I did use a couple of different tones, so I tended to go in there with a black first just to darken up and add some shadows to the carapace and just tone it down a little bit, and then I went over with a darker contrast paint just to get in those final details. And because we've got that darker undertone, that I'll just shift that brown subtly here and there, again adding to that mottled effect around the miniature. At this stage, I'm going to add a unifying wash using Villainy inks, Goon's Grime. This is a perfect enamel effect just to unify everything together, and it's also that nice brown that's going to add to that alien feel of the Tyranids. And I've applied this with an airbrush again. Due to the size of this miniature, I want it to be quick and effective, but there's nothing wrong with doing this with a brush as well. And if you want to know a little bit more about how to add the Goon's Grime and the reductive technique, then feel free to check out our reductive technique video here on the Grimdark Compendium YouTube. However, when I'm adding it to the miniature, I tend to concentrate a thicker build up to the lower sections, and as we get towards the top, I just tend to fade that effect off. Once the Goon's Grime has dried, I'm just going to come in with a Q-tip or a sponge lightly moistened with mineral spirits and just do an overall general cleanup of the miniature first, but then I'm going to come in with a brush just for a more controlled removal and manipulation of the Goon's Grime. Now, one little extra tip I will give you for some of the larger areas like the tail or some of its legs is, rather than just removing the Goon's Grime and adding some streaks, to create that more mottled effects that we're trying to achieve throughout this process, I'm just going to lightly moisten my brush with it and dab it into certain sections, like dot it here and there, and what that'll do, it'll cause the Goon's Grime to dissolve from the inside to the out, leaving the more mottled effect. And again, you can control this and remove it. It's all just around playing and trying to get the effect that you desire for your miniature. Again, places under its belly, I will add some little streaks to these, as though it might be some mucus that's sweated out of pores. And overall, we're just manipulating that grime because we've got a nice long working time with these enamels and just moving it about to the desired areas. Now we're going to add some more special effects, and we're going to do this by using Villainy's Carrying Crimson and Ichor of the Damned. For Carrying Crimson, I've applied this to all the joints and diseased areas, and where its fine pigments naturally create more of that mottling, and it'll enhance the overall texture of the miniature. Carrying Crimson is a special effects enamel that has a subtle granular effects to it, perfect for any of your Grimdark painting schemes. After this, if you want to add some more contrast or get a bit of variation in there, I do add a little bit of Ichor of the Damned to the Carrying Crimson and go back into some of those joints just to enhance the overall contrast. Then I'm going to come in with Ichor of the Damned Neat, and this will just help deepen some shadows, and it'll simulate some oozing wounds or some festering sores. And I tend to streak this as well from some of the pores to create the illusion of some seeping fluids. Both Ichor of the Damned and Carrying Crimson do tend to dry more satin to glossy, and this will just give us that much needed surface finish variation against the matte effect of the Goon's Grime. Moving on now to the Carapace, and first of all I'm going to add some Villainy's Decay of Death, and this will dry really matte to chalky, and this will just replicate some dried bodily fluids or fungal growths or some sickly biomatter that has fused the Tyranid armour together. Final refinements on the Carapace include a little bit of scratching, and this will go onto the bone areas and it'll just add some overall wear and tear and texture. For a little bit more information on this technique and some alternative colour recipes, I'd highly recommend going over and checking out Dark Ages Workshop's Tyranid tutorial here on our YouTube channel. At this stage, once you've touched up any other additional details that you might want to add to your Tyranid, you can pretty much call the model finished or battle ready. However, there are some additional techniques that we can apply to our miniature to really push it into that grimdark aesthetic. One of my favourite Grimdark techniques that I have also applied to this miniature is the glue method. It's an advanced way to create some unsettling organic effects. This method, though demanding, offers unparalleled control over unique textures, simulating stretched, torn flesh or translucent decayed tissues. When applied correctly, it transforms a miniature into something truly grotesque. The glue technique, along with more advanced methods and kitbashing ideas, is covered in depth in our Tyranid course over at the Grimdark Compendium. So if you're serious about your Tyranids and want to learn more about these styles and alternative techniques that you can apply to your army, then I'd highly recommend going over to the grimdarkcompendium.com and checking out our Tyranids course. One last realistic effects that we can add to our miniature and overall make everything tie together is the addition of some gloss varnish. Now we're not going to apply this to the entire miniature, I'm just going to selectively choose in and around where I'm going to add this to the miniature, maybe from vents or some pores, and just adding some overall general wet ichors in and around the Tyranid. Tyranids are a living nightmare, constantly reshaping themselves into something even more horrifying. Their combination of wet, fleshy textures, bone-like carapaces, and grotesque evolutionary adaptations make them the embodiment of bio-horror and unstoppable hunger, stripped of nobility, driven by raw, terrifying efficiency. As well, at the GDC we do have a vast catalogue of other methods and techniques that you can utilise within your Grimdark skin painting, such as the recently released Tormenticles by Dark Ages Workshop. Don't forget as well, this weekend we have just released the first episode of the Trench Pilgrims from the Trench Crusade. I'd also like to take this opportunity to tell you about my artist bundle, and this bundle includes the Villainy Inks starter set along with a choice of any of my courses at the Grimdark Compendium, completely free of charge and yours to keep forever. One of the course choices is my upcoming Death Corps of Krieg course, and this is set to release at the end of March or early April. I'd like to thank you all for coming along and spending your time here. I've been Nate the Feral Painter, and until next time, I will catch you in the next video.